what ethical issues face antinatalism? Now, what I mean by that is if everyone were to adopt antinatalism and we ceased reproducing, what ethical issues would then be brought to the forefront of our public conversation and that we would be compelled to at least spend some time discussing before we were to go voluntarily extinct? Now, I've brought a few ideas together which I'm going to discuss in this video, but I completely understand that I might have missed some. So if there are some that you want to include below, or you just want to add thoughts on top of the ones I've given in this video, then again, leave a comment below. Now, obviously, not everyone is going to accept antinatalism. That isn't going to happen, but I think it can be interesting to think about this potential future where people could and what ethical issues might arise from that. So without further ado, let's get into them. The first and most obvious one is, how should we go extinct? Now, obviously, when it comes to antinatalism, that is going to be through voluntarily ceasing reproduction. But when I say how should we go extinct, I mean over what duration? Now, some conversation around this has already happened. For example, in David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, he discusses this in one of the chapters. He discusses the idea of phased extinction, and phased extinction seems like one of the two sort of core ways that this could happen. One is that we all agree just to stop reproducing overnight, as it were, and there is a sort of obvious and immediate final generation that then live out their lives, probably in not the best circumstances, to put it lightly, and then once they die off, the human race goes extinct. The other fairly obvious option is a phased extinction, where the relatively immediate end goal is humans dying off as a species, but there are some intermediate generations, maybe 2 or 3, where procreation is phased out and people in batches voluntarily stop reproducing. Exactly how that would look, it's going to be decided by the people who do that, if it's ever done, but hopefully you're at least understanding the concept of a phased extinction, a general stepping down of procreation over time. What that does is hopes to ease the burden on those who already exist and will exist as part of that phasing down of the extinction itself. Because if you have a relatively immediate extinction where everyone just ceases reproduction, that obviously has the advantage of fewer beings coming into existence and suffering the harms of existence, but it also means that those who are in existence as part of the going extinct are going to have probably a completely awful time. The pros and cons of the phased extinction is that you ease the burden that extinction has on those experiencing the extinction or the dying off of the species, but it does mean that you're going to have to bring some more beings into existence to facilitate that. Which of those two is the more ethical to advocate? I actually don't know, and if humans in some wild alternative reality did agree to all voluntarily stop reproducing, which of those two options they would take, again, I have no idea. But that's the first of the ethical issues that I feel will face antinatalism if everyone adopts it. Or maybe it's more accurate to say face us as a result of everyone adopting antinatalism rather than face antinatalism. The second ethical issue, which is kind of related and is maybe not as intuitive, is whether or not to pursue immortality or life extension. Now, where this comes from is that antinatalism is all about the starting of life. So as long as you get to a point where you're not starting any new lives of sentient beings, you've basically gotten to an antinatalist world. What happens to the beings who already exist is then a different matter entirely. Now, what we already discussed is about going extinct, and obviously that would be those beings that are in existence at that time accepting that, yeah, they are going to just let life run its natural course in terms of their lives, and at some point they will die and let the species go extinct. Another option is not pursuing extinction or not allowing extinction to occur and actually pursuing life extension or even immortality. Now, there are obviously ethical considerations here with regards to antinatalism in practice, in that the benefits of immortality, assuming that you have some way obviously to voluntarily die if you want that, the benefit to immortality would be that you can continue to pursue all of the things and interact with all of the people that you wish to and enjoy in your life, and it is not cut short by what our species has evolved to generally live to in terms of age. So that seems like a good, again, assuming that you have some access to ending it all. You don't just say, I'm gonna live forever, and then you can't take it back. The downside of it is, though, is that if humans in this situation did pursue life extension or immortality, that would obviously extend the window for people to then decide to revert away from antinatalism. So if people decide to use life extension technology or pursue life extension technology or immortality and they're successful, this obviously massively increases the window these people are going to be alive and can can reproduce, and all of that time leaves open for them to potentially change their mind and decide to start reproducing again. Of course, continuing to exist indefinitely is not inherently in conflict with antinatalism, but in practice it extends the window within which you can decide to reproduce. So there is a bit of tension there in practice. The third ethical issue that would face us if antinatalism were fully embraced would be what to do with the final generation. So whether that final generation comes about by voluntarily everyone ceasing reproduction straight away, or a phased extinction, and so there's probably a smaller and well catered for final generation, at some point there will be a final generation. And whilst this is very much related to the first ethical issue of phased or immediate extinction, because those two things are going to heavily determine our ability to facilitate at least some sort of adequate life for the final generation, it is somewhat distinct. Our general approach to the final generation is going to be something that, regardless of whether it's immediate or phased, we are going to need to make a decision about, because if we pursue a phased extinction, that's going to give us more time to prepare the final generation for being the final generation, but how we prepare them is the thing that needs to be decided. Now, I do not purport to have any sort of detailed idea on how this should be done, but of course things that come to mind are things like heavily relying on automation to run the jobs and errands that need to be done for the final generation that would have in ordinary circumstances be done by the next generation, like elderly care, for example. Another thing that could be facilitated would be access to a completely dignified way and painless way of dying, because in the final generation, I'm assuming they obviously want to try and have as good a life as possible given the circumstances, but once it gets to the point where you're going to be heavily reliant on others for care, that is not ideal even in today's world where you can rely on a next generation. And so in those circumstances, you're likely going to want to have the option to at least just gracefully exit yourself when you want to. The other thing that comes to mind is stockpiling. So obviously previous generations could have stockpiled resources and materials that would be used by the final generation, so they don't have to prepare them and construct them themselves, because they would just have less manpower to be able to do that. Apart from those three things that I'm just spitballing, I don't have anything particular to say on this topic. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below, so let me know. So those three ethical issues were ones pertaining to the lives of those that would be part of a final generation, or humans that are generally part of the project of us voluntarily going extinct. The next two ethical issues will be pertaining to lives other than the humans that are deciding to go extinct. The first of those ethical issues is, well, it actually does include humans, but it's of those of dependents. Now, those deciding to voluntarily cease reproducing, these are going to be moral agents, humans that are cognitively developed such that they can make moral decisions about this sort of thing, about procreative ethics. But there are obviously many humans that do not have these cognitive abilities, and there are many non-human animals that are dependents of ours, like companion animals, that also can't make these decisions for themselves. This is going to be an ethical issue that humans will have to face if they are in this circumstance of voluntarily going extinct. A discussion is going to have to be had about how do we facilitate the care of these beings, how do we perhaps avoid more of them coming into existence so they aren't around when we actually get to the final generation and then it's even more of a difficult circumstance. How can we facilitate their general care if our capacities are going to diminish, if we are generally pursuing extinction? All these sorts of questions are going to have to be asked and discussed and considered, and I don't purport to have any answers for these questions. If you have any thoughts on this ethical issue, then let me know in the comments below. One thing to consider is that given these beings are dependent on human moral agents for their care, if all of the human moral agents go extinct, it is going to leave behind these beings in a way where they actually can't function for themselves. The final ethical issue, and the second one that relates to beings other than those who are choosing to go extinct, is the issue of if humans choose to go extinct, what would happen to wild animals? And I guess some people would open this up to what would happen generally to any life in the universe that has the capacity to suffer. Now, this is an ethical issue that many people have already discussed in in the antinatalist sphere, and it's one that brings a lot of heated debate and controversy. And very much related to this is the idea of ethylism, which I've done a video on, which I will link in the description. You can check out my thoughts on ethylism and an exploration into ethylism. But core to this ethical issue is that us humans who are choosing to go extinct will be leaving behind a planet that is populated by sentient beings that often have awful lives and will in many cases be tearing each other apart. Whether humans intervene to mitigate this suffering in some way or end this suffering in some way, and then a further question as to whether humans extend their own suffering by continuing reproducing to facilitate this mitigation of wild animal suffering, or we don't continue reproducing and we just try to mitigate it as best we can whilst we're still here. These are all things that would need to at least be given some conversation. So let me know what you thought of these ethical issues that would face us if everyone adopted antinatalism. I'd be really interested to hear how people think we could pursue them or should pursue them if we were ever in this circumstance. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know if there are other ethical issues that I haven't brought up in this video, and I'll see you in the next one.